Welcome back to another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Join us on our journey to learn more about the Christian faith and how we can live it out in our modern world. In 2020, 2.4% of all deaths in Canada were attributed to medically assisted death. This number rose to 3.3% in 2021 and 4.1% in 2022. We have Amanda Achtman with us today to shed light on this concerning trend. Travis, over to you.
Thanks, Rigel, and thank you, everybody, as always, for tuning in to another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. We're going to start this week's episode with a quote that comes from a statement from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, which they released on November 30th, 2023. I won't read the whole statement, but the statement included the following. Despite the pressure being applied to Catholic healthcare institutions by some to perform or to provide medical assistance in dying, in other words, euthanasia or assisted suicide, the Catholic Church, which regards life as sacred and inviolable, remains firm in its opposition. Euthanasia and assisted suicide have always been and will always be morally unacceptable because they are affronts to human dignity and violations of natural and divine law. Catholic healthcare affirms that every person made in the image of God has intrinsic value regardless of ability or health. For these reasons, we, the members of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, unanimously and unequivocally oppose the performance of either euthanasia or assisted suicide within health organizations with a Catholic identity. We oppose any efforts by governments or others to compel such facilities to perform medical assistance in dying in violation of Catholic teachings. So to talk about this, and maybe from a higher level, the general idea of death on demand, or a culture of death, or whatever we want to call it, we're joined today by Amanda Achtman. Amanda studied in Calgary at St. Mary's University and the University of Calgary before working in journalism, crowdfunding, and advocacy in defense of Canadians' fundamental freedoms in Toronto. She then worked with a member of parliament seeking to prevent the expansion of euthanasia to persons living with a disability or mental illness. Amanda then moved to Rome, where she completed a licentiate degree at the Pontifical Gregorian University. She now works with Canadian Physicians for Life on ethics, education, and cultural engagement, and she engages people in conversations about suffering, death, meaning, and hope through her cultural project, Dying to Meet You. So, Amanda, thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you here. To start off the conversation, can you tell us a little bit about why it is that death and thinking about death became something that you have dedicated yourself to professionally, personally, and you spend all of your time or a lot of your time thinking about?
Amanda, I want to add on to that question. You actually dedicated yourself to write a blog about this topic for 365 days in a row. I'm also curious, following Travis's question, what kind of effect that had on you personally, mentally, spiritually, and so on?
Sure. Well, it could be a little bit unusual that for my 30th birthday, my colleagues in the office got me a skull to put on the desk, a little memento mori. They said, in honor of your birthday, we got you a reminder of your death. And they were very sincere and very genuine in choosing this gift because it was right in the course of that year where I had decided to blog about death and dying every single day for 365 days. They had meant to get a little skull to go at the desk, but actually they ordered almost a life-size skull on Amazon. And so that's very memorable. But yeah, it was basically in the course of working in the office of a member of parliament that we knew within our office that unfortunately this was basically and politically a foregone conclusion, that we were outnumbered in parliament and that the majority support was for the eradication of safeguards that were deemed essential just some years prior, and to the expansion of euthanasia to further demographics, specifically persons with disability or with mental illness as a sole underlying condition. And mindful that this law was set to pass and that we had done our utmost to warn against it, to give voice to different persons with disabilities, from Indigenous communities to the elderly, to all of those most at risk due to this expansion. We were also wondering, what can we do within the small political office and among my friends and peers on Parliament Hill? What can we do to take personal responsibility to address the cultural crisis that we have, where euthanasia has increasingly become a temptation, where suicide has gained popularity as an expression of the malaise in our time. So it was in that context that I made this New Year's resolution to blog about death and dying every day for that year.
So, as an individual, a person who has ones that you love, maybe these issues have affected you personally, friends, family. How has this affected you? Thinking about it, worrying about it. You mentioned that you were working in an environment where it felt like it was a foregone conclusion. You were basically fighting a losing battle, and yet you still showed up to fight every single day. What effect did that have on you as an individual?
One of my first decisions with the blog was not to actually write about euthanasia explicitly, but I wanted to recapture a right understanding of death and dying and to think, what is the ideal way to suffer and die? Because euthanasia simply didn't strike me as an ideal. It isn't attractive enough. It represented a kind of conceding and capitulating that I think I wouldn't wish for anyone, including those with whom I disagree most vehemently on this issue. And so the starting point was to write about death in a way that was edifying and ultimately oriented toward hope. Not in a trivial way, not in a flippant way, as it could hardly be possible to do that. Justice to persons requires taking these weighty topics really to heart. But I found that in the course of trying to write about these topics, it was still during the pandemic and there were a lot of restrictions. It helped me to go out of myself and to kind of revive the horizon that is beyond what was right before me with amidst lockdowns and travel bans and just kind of the inward thinking that we might have been prone to in that period especially. But instead I was interviewing people. I was asking them about their experiences. I was asking them who they admire, who are their role models. I was asking them to tell me stories about a death in their family. Sometimes that was an opener for a conversation. And to my surprise, everyone wanted to talk. I have never come across someone who didn't want to share their story. Maybe they don't want to publicize it, but I've never met someone who doesn't appreciate the opportunity to share their story with me. And that just became a basis for the work that has become so honestly nourishing and actually enlivening in the course of working on this difficult topic of suffering and death.
No, that's awesome, Amanda. I mean, I would imagine writing about a topic like death for such a long period can get to you, but approaching it from the position of hope, I feel like that changes everything. Travis, I know you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, and you actually just led me right to it. The word hope. I want to focus on that. We are Christians. You know our story. If you've listened to our podcast before, you know that we are committed to the Catholic faith, and we are called to hope. It's kind of non-negotiable. It's a part of our faith. That isn't the case for non-Christians necessarily, and it is something even that many well-intentioned, well-meaning, committed Christians struggle with, to have hope. It is very, very difficult. And statistically, we can look at all sorts of things that would indicate that there is a lack of hope in many corners of our society, disconcertingly so. Amanda, what is it for you that gives you hope and helps you focus on it as you're going out and talking to people about what is for many people something that is entirely impossible to think about without being dreadfully fearful?
A few things come to mind. One is this beautiful quotation of Carol Houselander, who describes compassion as a communion in suffering of those who love. And it really is in the intimacy of these conversations, in the kind of mutual entrustment that happens when you share stories of anguish. It is the case. And I find, even speaking in particular to young people, I can ask them in a classroom, can you remember a time when someone has shared something really difficult, really agonizing with you? And they're thinking about it, they're thinking about their experiences. And I say, do you realize how intimate it became to share and to confide and to entrust something so important and significant. And even just hearing words like that, entrust, confide, intimate, in this context, they sit up taller, they sit up straighter, they lean in, they're interested, because we're made for depth. And death removes all that is extraneous and superficial. And I think that's why, as a young person, I was attracted to stories, whether it was stories of child soldiers in Africa or about history of the Holocaust, whatever it was, I was attracted to stories of gravity because they somehow brought me to the essential. And I think people are really starved in the superficial and the ephemeral to come to these questions of what is ultimately essential.
Amanda, one of the trends that we've seen just in society as a whole is, I'll say instant gratification, but what I really mean is prioritization of the short term over the long term. We know that when it comes to the topic of medically assisted death, someone might be going through a period of suffering, and there's hope just over the hill, but getting to that point or being able to see that or persevere through their suffering is difficult for a lot of people. How have you seen people deal with this? I'm sure some people have chosen medically assisted death, but those that haven't, how have you seen them deal with their suffering?
It's a great question, and a friend of mine comes to mind who, in the course of living with bipolar and struggling with a totally debilitating depression, told me that she would have walked across Canada on broken glass to request MAID. It was so dire and so desperate, and she was so keen, she thought, to end her life because that's what depression entails. It is debilitating. And honestly, I would like to say explicitly that it's not surprising that people are tempted to want to die. What's surprising and novel in our Canadian situation is that rather than coming alongside such a person and saying, "We're with you, we will not abandon you, you cannot see it now, but I will see for you what you cannot see," that's what we need to do. So she said, this woman in particular, that what helped her when she was in the throes of that very deep depression was someone said to her, "Thank you for staying alive, because I recognize that this is the hardest thing that you have to do." And that affirmation that came from outside of her was very empowering. It recognized the struggle. And I think, especially within the church, it's so important that we increase our attention to mental health, that we increase our attention to the need for a real accompaniment, not glossing over the serious nature and weight of the things that really can debilitate us, and recognizing that we live this alternation in turn. If you are strong today, then help me when I am weak. And if you are going through a difficult time next week, then hopefully I have been equipped by the service that you rendered to me to be there for you.
You are touching on something that is near and dear to my heart. Rigel knows this. Mental illness is something that runs deep in my family. I myself have a relatively mild form of it, although I do have, I have an anxiety disorder, which when it manifests itself, feels like anything but mild. But objectively speaking, it's significantly less intense than members of my family. It has led to suicide attempts, multiple suicide attempts. And of course, I won't talk about those certain circumstances, but wrestling with people trying to take their own life has been a part of my entire life, effectively. And even closer to home, if that's possible, even closer to home relatively recently, my best friend took his own life 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, right now. That was, I think, the first time I can think of. I mean, when my grandparents died, that was hard. And there's other people in my social circle that have died. But my very best friend, to get a phone call from his father, and I refused to believe the words. It was just that it couldn't be real. And that was the first time that I really wrestled with someone wanting to leave this world. Wrestling was something so profound. And this was before I was a Catholic. So I had come back to the Christian faith, but I had not yet found the church, and I hadn't found the church's teachings, and it fully embraced them as I have now. And so at the time, I was devastated because I'd lost my friend. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the dignity of human life, how every life, no matter how deep the suffering, no matter how hard the circumstances, every life has value. But I think that's how most people look at life today. They don't see life. And I think we could use abortion as an example. 80% plus of Canadians think, death on demand in the womb is just something that is acceptable. So that tells me pretty much everything I need to know about the general idea of whether or not life is seen as sacred in this country. It won't be much different in other advanced countries in the West. Amanda, what has been your experience talking to people across this country? I'd imagine you've talked to people from all sorts of faith backgrounds and non-faith backgrounds. What has been your experience talking to people about this, the reality for us committed Catholics, that life is sacred? Every life is sacred. Do you get pushback on that? Do you have people that are convinced by that? What have you found in talking to people during your last couple of years?
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing about your experience. And I want to say that every day when I have these conversations, people share stories of loss and grief that indicate how much we need each other and we need to have these conversations candidly, because unfortunately, we all have experiences of tremendous loss and grief, and this, far from diminishing it, enhances the moral urgency and the pastoral urgency, the ministerial urgency of attending to it. Now, for the sanctity of life, maybe not everyone is familiar with that language, but everyone loves someone. Everyone has a kind of reverence for the life that they love. And yet, mysteries of suffering and illness greatly perplex us in this regard. I was staying in Vancouver for a little while, and I was at an Airbnb owned by a Chinese woman who was renting out several rooms in a large house. And she invited me to join her and this other Turkish guest at her Airbnb to have some dumplings together. And so I was grateful for her hospitality, sat down with the two of them, and right away, with these two strangers, got the typical question, what do you do for work? And I answered, as I say all the time, that I prevent euthanasia and I encourage hope. Both of them looked completely flabbergasted when I said this. And this woman said to me immediately, well, I think I would like the doctor to suicide me if I was suffering. That's how she put it. At this moment, this Turkish young man looked horrified and said to her, don't say that. You are really scaring me right now. And I said to her, just a moment ago, you had been telling both of us about your two grandchildren, a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. If this is the reaction from a Turkish Airbnb guest in your home for some weeks, imagine the toll that your premature death would have on those grandchildren of yours. And she said, I hadn't thought about it like that because I was only thinking of my own pain. And I think in all of these circumstances, that is a common feature. And not to fault persons for it. In the midst of despair or suicidal ideation, it is typical to be thinking only of your own pain. But again, we need someone to come alongside and say, and yet I am with you. You are not alone. There's so little that we can do to cure and to solve sometimes, and that can make people retreat and feel like there's nothing worth engaging over. But one of the most powerful things that we can do and say, very much inspired by our faith, but not exclusive to it, is the powerful words, I am with you.
Amanda, I wonder if you can speak to the psychological difference between suicide and medically assisted death. And what I mean by that, and I'll try to phrase this well, but I apologize in advance if I phrase this poorly. The people who say yes to medically assisted death, they have the option, I'm assuming, of also committing suicide. If they want to end their life, that is an option. Also, we'll cut this out if this sounds horrible, but I'm really curious. Why is it that they are okay with medically assisted death, but they do not actively seek out suicide?
This is a very good question, and I think it's important to unpack because Canada has such a high euthanasia rate, specifically because, unlike the United States, where there is assisted suicide, which requires the patient to administer the lethal substance, him or herself, in Canada, more than 99% of cases are doctor or nurse administered. So while the patient always has the option that they could self administer, people don't. And there's this kind of mutual outsourcing of responsibility going on. For the doctor or nurse, it's the patient's request. So there's this outsourcing of responsibility. And for the patient, it's the outsourcing of responsibility to the medical professional who performs the act. And so this has a huge toll on the removal of a sense of responsibility and participation in the act itself.
That's I'm glad you asked that, Rigel. I've never actually really thought about that, but you're right. And if I can think about the example of my friend who took his own life, I know relatively well the details surrounding that. I also know that I refused to believe it at the time, and over time, as the grief has subsided, I've accepted that this wasn't an isolated incident, that it was the latest in a series of attempts to take his own life, and he did not live in Canada at the time, and I don't know what would have happened if he had, especially now, like if a few years had gone by, would he have had a different avenue to get the same end result, which is to no longer be living in this world? I don't know, but I think that question, Roger, that you asked highlights the nuances, the complexities surrounding this, and I think why even seemingly small policy decisions that I've never even thought about before, but we see the difference they make in the numbers between two countries that, we could probably say the United States is culturally about as similar to Canada as it gets. And yet we see a huge difference because of that one single thing. Amanda, when you think about Canada, and I know your expertise is here, but you've also spent time in other parts of the world. You've lived in Poland, you've lived in Italy. I would imagine you have a decent understanding about the landscape in other places when it comes to these issues. So when you think about Canada, our home, are you hopeful? Are you horrified? Where do you fall in terms of your perception on where we are today with euthanasia, assisted suicide, and everything that's going on?
One of the questions I am asked pretty often is euthanasia a first world problem? Is it a sign of a kind of decadence within the society? You've mentioned some of the European countries where I've lived. I also travel a lot to the Middle East and to other parts of the world where the people who live in these places would say to me, and do say to me, we have a lot of problems. Corruption is rampant, violence, war, but we don't have these problems, meaning our particular problems. There, such persons tell me, usually I'm with them, so they'll say, here we do everything we can to live, and there you're telling us people are doing everything they can to die. And that really brings home the stark contrast. People are very perplexed when I explain the extent of euthanasia in Canada, because for so many, Canada is a utopia and represents the best healthcare, the longest lifespan, the greatest opportunity of which they can dream. So there is this chasm, and I am hopeful for Canada because I do think that people have a longing for better. Our euthanasia society represents a moment of conceding and capitulating, but a request for euthanasia, I think, I'm firmly convinced, is not so much the expression of a desire to die as it's the expression of a disappointment. And most people asking for it, and similarly, most persons contemplating suicide, if they were asked, if you could live a different way, would you? The answer is yes. But it's the inescapability, it's the unmanageable life circumstances that stifle a person's hopes. And in this regard, I often speak about euthanasia as a form of self-harm. And when I say that, young people really take note, because it demonstrates that these tendencies to self-hatred or self-rejection are not restricted to a certain time period of life or to one demographic against another, but they are a common feature of our wounded and vulnerable humanity. And whenever we face those temptations to self-hatred or self-rejection, the answer is to come alongside and show the person through presence, through words, it's good you exist. I'm glad you're here.
Amanda, the things you mentioned are really interesting. In countries where they are lacking basic necessities, like you said, they're fighting to live. With this mentality of it gets better, like there is something to strive for. But here in Canada, where it seems like we have everything that we need, like amazing social support and everything like that, and it's like maybe it doesn't get better. Like it doesn't seem like there's anything to strive for. Like it's psychologically speaking, and maybe it's like if like it just speaks to the importance of struggle and suffering in our lives. It gives us something to work towards, like this hope, like you mentioned, of of a better life. It's so important to who we are as human beings.
Building on what Rigel just said, and Amanda, you talked about the time you've spent in other countries, many of which I would imagine you would classify as developing or undeveloped, possibly, countries. Something Rigel and I, for different reasons, know a thing or two about. Rigel was born in India, grew up in Thailand, has come to the West, the UK first, Canada now. This is his home. So, clearly he's lived in very different places, and he would be, the first one to attest to the problems. There's problems everywhere. The problems are just different. And for me, I'm born and raised in this country. It's my home. My wife, however, was a child refugee. She came to this country. It offered her and her family a chance at a dignified life because their lives were threatened in, at the time, what was the most dangerous country on the planet. It's not that bad anymore. It's not great still. But now, having said that, I spend a lot of time in that country. That country is Colombia. I speak the language terribly, but I do. I spend a lot of time there. My wife and I are expecting our first child, and we think seriously about where will we raise our children, because the things that most people look to Canada for, it's safe, it's rich, it has opportunity. Yes, all of that is true, and it's purely material. As a Catholic Christian, that isn't what matters most to me. What matters more to me are things like respect for the human person, dignity of life, moral issues. All of that stuff is super important to me, and I'm not the only person. I know that. So when my wife and I think about where do we want to raise our children and what do we want to expose them to, going to Colombia is a live option for us. We were literally at the Colombian consulate today, learning what it would take for me to get Colombian citizenship. No, I'm not saying I'm going to abandon Canada. God put me in this place for a reason. I'm sure I'm called to be here and to do something. But I'd be lying if I said I'm super optimistic when I think about issues like abortion and, increasingly, as I learn more, euthanasia, and how readily accepted it seems to be among the general population. Can you convince me why I should be more optimistic about this country that I was born in, raised in, I earn an income in, I live in? Can you convince me why I should be more optimistic on this issue specifically?
Well, one of the reasons is because people like your wife came to it. And I do think this is a sincere basis for our hope. So many immigrants and refugees and people seeking opportunity from all around the world choose to come to Canada with aspirations. And I would hope that the Canadian population at large could learn and integrate the best practices and aspirations of those who come, that they would be retained and not lost, that we would leverage the capacity for resilience and moral imagination that so many people coming to Canada bring as a gift when they arrive of their very survival and impetus to come. So that's one thing. I think, for example, of Yazidi refugees who I've spent time with in the GTA, and I sometimes speak with them very openly about this issue of euthanasia, and I say, Canadians are asking for euthanasia. You have told me that you lost 25 of your family members in the genocide by ISIS. How do you go on? And they say things like, we don't think about it, we just live, or we have our children to feed, or how could we betray our ancestors who we lost by not doing our utmost to live? These are the kinds of reflections that I think, without intending to judge or shame, do rather indict someone who would seek euthanasia. Because if we are to suppose that there is any threshold of suffering that would justify an end to a person's life, there are surely people who have exceeded that threshold, and yet they live. And some might say, well, good for them, I don't have the capacity to bear it. Well, their example is that reproach to any attitude that would say it's impossible. And that's not to diminish a person's real pain. There is a relative and subjective dimension to it. But I think that we need each other. And I so imagine and wish sometimes that I could bring my Yazidi friends to the hospital room of someone requesting euthanasia and have them connect.
I want to reinforce some of the optimism, Amanda. To answer your question, Travis, another few reasons to be optimistic is actually one of the answers that Amanda gave. The outsourcing of responsibility with respect to the actual act of medical assisted death. Just the fact that they want to outsource that responsibility shows that they feel that there is something inherently wrong with the act. Otherwise, they would be okay accepting that responsibility. Do you get what I mean? Like, just the fact that they're like, I don't want responsibility for this decision and I don't want responsibility for the action is kind of just them saying that this doesn't feel quite right, but I want it anyway. And like, I don't want to feel some type of way about it. Another story that comes to mind, heartbreaking story. I just saw the article today and I saw that Amanda had commented on it as well. There was a mother in England who took her son's life. He was diagnosed with a form of cancer, I believe. And she didn't say that she was going to take his life. What she said was, "Do you want me to take the pain away?" Now, she said to the reporters that she knew that the kid knew that she was going to take his life. But I mean, there's no way to prove that. That just seems like such an outrageous claim. And maybe we'll talk more about this story, Amanda. Maybe there's some more light that you can shed on this. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And sadly, to go back to a little bit of the pessimistic side and for a little bit of context for our listeners, historically, it was terminally ill patients that could request medically assisted death. But Canada is moving towards a position where even people suffering from mental health issues will be able to request medically assisted death. Now, to be clear, we don't even allow people with mental health issues to sign contracts. It's not valid. They can't even get married. But we are saying that it's okay for them to request death. This just seems insane to me and maybe a reason to be pessimistic about Canada's future. So, Amanda, I'd love your thoughts.
To the story of this mother who says that she prematurely ended the life of her 7-year-old son, and she notes that she did this 43 years ago, and she mentioned that she also has a terminal illness right now and is kind of bringing the story to the fore as the UK considers legalizing euthanasia. I think what's very necessary to analyze is the extent to which the surrounding family and friends cannot bear the suffering. especially when it comes to children. We know how excruciating it is, or we can imagine, if we don't know, how excruciating it would be for a parent to watch his or her child suffer, let alone die of a terminal illness. And yet, palliative care physicians often attest to children being remarkable patients who are capable even of doing things like reassuring their parents, trying to put them at ease, being attentive to them. This is a mystery, but it's commonly attested to. And so we have to be very careful about the extent of projection that is making us incapable to abide the suffering for which the patient at the center of the patient who ought to be the protagonist in this story may actually have a greater threshold. And that's after proper palliative care has been provided, and the person always deserves to be genuinely treated and cared for. But I do think we have an indication of this also with persons with disabilities. Many times it's other people who cannot bear that that person has a disability, but the person living with the disability, him or herself, attests to their life being worth living and to rising above the obstacles that they thought were overwhelming after some adaptation and growth.
I really like that you mentioned there the mystery of children. And this is particularly poignant for both Rajal and I as we prepare to welcome our first children into the world, and reflecting more. I find myself spending more time thinking about, the amazing little quirks and beautiful things about my nephews or the children of my friends and stuff as my wife and I expect our first child. There's a passage, I'm going to butcher it as I always do when I try to quote C.S. Lewis, because his stuff it all runs together. But in one of C.S. Lewis's novels, it is called The Screwtape Letters. We've talked about it briefly before on the podcast. For those that don't know it, I highly recommend it. It's actually terrifying. Take it seriously. It's super terrifying. And I won't ruin it, but there's a part in the book where he effectively lays out how, isn't it interesting how it seems like as people get older, they become more aware of death. So the more life that they have, the more they become attached to it. Whereas children often seem to be the ones that have either no fear whatsoever or are possibly at the same time completely at peace with the fact that this is temporary, this will not last. That struck me so much because I read it when I was going through a health crisis, which I now look back and credit my conversion to first Christianity generally and then to the Catholic faith specifically. If not for that health crisis, I don't know where I'd be. But while I was going through it, I read that and it struck me because I was unable to deny how true it is. The more things I can cling to in this world, the more I desperately cling to the ability to cling to those things. And I wasn't like that as a kid. So I think that's, your word of mystery there, Amanda, is really, really excellent. Changing the direction of the conversation a little bit, can you tell us a little more about Dying to Meet You? Why you wanted to do it in the first place? How it has gone, how it has changed you, whatever you'd like to tell us about Dying to Meet You.
Sure. So it started as this year-long blogging project, and before that was at dyingtomeetyou.ca. So the blog has archived there, but my new iteration of the project is at dyingtomeetyou.com. And basically, after this year of blogging, I then moved to Rome and I took a break. I said, God, okay, that was intense working on these issues. It was very heavy. It had taken a toll on me, to be sure. And so I then found this beautiful program in Rome where I was able to spend 2 years really thinking about the resurrection of the dead and what the impact of believing in bodily resurrection has on all our bioethical issues. I really felt called to move from here to there to think about this. And when I finished the program, I felt a call to come back to Canada with a sense that Canada is a field of mission, to spread this message that there is no good story without suffering. That doesn't mean we need to seek it. As great African American writer James Baldwin says, like, enough is as good as a feast when it comes to suffering, but those who do not know how to suffer and learn how to suffer can never grow up, can never discover who and what we are. And that leads me when I'm speaking, and that's a part of Dying to Meet You, is speaking across Canada and even internationally. I say, particularly to older Canadians, that my generation, our growth and development is stunted as long as we're in a euthanasia society because of that inability to grow up and discover who we are through facing up to the realities of life and death. So Dying to Meet You is this mix of speaking, writing, producing short films with people's stories, little vignettes, and also organizing community events. So for example, in Calgary, I organized an event in the fall on the theme of the church as an expert in humanity. 200 people came out, and in the morning, we had a ministry hall of exhibits with table displays of all the ministries doing the best work around suffering, death, meaning, and hope. So like a funeral lunch ministry, widows ministry, miscarriage ministry. It was really moving. In the afternoon, we had panel presentations, and in the evening, we had a night of testimony where 7 people who normally wouldn't necessarily have a platform to speak in church gave 3-minute testimonies that were narratively framed as echoes of the 7 last words of Christ from the cross. So after hearing, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," a young Middle Eastern Christian refugee got up and spoke about trying to not harbor resentment after having his life on hold for almost a decade. We had a core member from the L'Arche community, so a member living with disabilities, speak, and he said, "Here in L'Arche, I get to be myself. I get to have a community and a simple witness that in L'Arche, it was a kind of paradise for him that he could be in such a communion of persons." We had a young father whose daughter only lived for 37 minutes speak. And others, an Indigenous woman, for the line, "I thirst," we had a former alcoholic give a testimony. And I think it's in this reality of life, in this grit of life, that we can have the conversations that are difficult and painful, because we become a shelter for the wounds of others, but only in our very own woundedness. Only when we're willing to bear our own vulnerability can we really be a safe abode for others to share and confide theirs, which is what we all crave and need so desperately.
Before I turn it over to Rigel, Amanda, I want to highlight one quick thing that you just explained there that makes me question your judgment. You came back to Canada from Rome. I don't know, but I was just in Rome, and I would not have made that decision. I almost didn't get on the plane. Everything else you said, I'm totally on board with. That single thing, though, it's I struggle with that. Anyways, Rigel, over to you.
No, I have to comment on that. I really have to comment on that. So you have coffee in the name of your podcast, and the coffee in Rome is great, but there are no cafes to sit and linger in. You got to drink it at the bar in 2 seconds. And
Touché.
I got to say, I miss the cafe culture where you can get your work done, have a long visit with a friend, sit with some music that actually kind of invites you to linger there. So most people don't have any patience for me complaining about my time in Rome, but I did miss that. And just briefly as well, I do think that Canada is this kind of field of mission, and that is partly inspired by the White Rose Resistance movement, the young German Christians who opposed the Nazis and distributed pamphlets to try and raise awareness. They had the sense, Hans and Sophie Scholl, we're Christians and we're Germans, therefore we are responsible for Germany. And that kept them there and responsible. And so I always encourage to think, what does your own identity reveal about your mission? I am this, and I am this, therefore I am responsible for what? How do the facts of your existence lead you to the particularity of your life?
I was just gonna say it's lucky that Amanda did come back. She came back on a mission, so went to Rome for her formation and stuff, and it came back with a stronger resolve for the mission that she's on, which is great. And the work that you're doing is really important, I think, because you mentioned how for a lot of people considering medically assisted death, they need someone outside to walk that walk with them and be that outside voice. And our medical system is not serving that role. I think Roger Foley is a good example of this. And again, for context for our audience, Roger Foley, I believe, has a neurodegenerative disorder, and he needs full time care for the rest of his life now. But instead of offering him the kind of care that he needs, the medical system is just offering medically assisted death. So they're basically saying you're not going to get the care you need, but we can offer you death. And that's just not who he is. Like he doesn't want to die, but he's being offered death. And for the people who are more inclined towards death, they need someone with an outside voice to come in and say, "Hey, no, you deserve to live. There's dignity in your life. There's value in your life." So thank you for doing the work that you're doing, Amanda.
That's a great example, Rigel. And what we'll do for everyone listening with these references that we're making, Amanda, I think it's a short film, Amanda, that you made that was released about a month or so ago. So we'll put these links to these sources that we're referencing, and we encourage people to check them out. Amanda's work, it makes an impact. Like, you'll watch it and you'll feel something, and hopefully feel called in whatever way. Feel called to do something about this, even if, at the bare minimum, even if you start thinking about this issue when you previously haven't, which I think for many of us is actually a very real thing. Most of us just don't think about this. I certainly didn't until recently. If I had never come to the Catholic Church, I don't know, but this would not have crossed my mind. I either would have accepted the general narrative that offering people death on demand is in some way kindness and not thought critically about it, or I would have given it a little thought and then somehow arrived at the conclusion that I've got more important things to worry about. And I don't believe that now, because I live in this country. I'm going to have children in this country. I love many people in this country, and I want all of them to live in a place where our lives are seen as valuable, no matter what suffering we're going through. And I don't know that we can confidently say that today. In fact, I'm confident we cannot confidently say that today. So with that said, Amanda, going forward, knowing the work that you're doing now, the impact it's having, are you making plans for other things? Do you have anything in the works about what comes next? What's the future hold for you fighting this fight in this country of Canada?
Mainly, I'm going to stay available for whatever is needed, because some years ago I could not have anticipated that I would be preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope. It didn't exist. It wasn't a problem. And so my encouragement to those who are trying to figure out their vocation and find a sense of mission is, it might just be around the corner in a way that you can prepare yourself for, in terms of your disposition and your prayer life and your intellectual life. But maybe the mission will be given to you in a way that you can't simply seize, you can only receive. And so I plan to continue receiving this unfolding mission as it comes and as I can respond to the needs. In some ways, Canada is serving as a warning to other countries of the path not to go down. And so, of course, I feel a sense of priority for Canada, my home country. And at the same time, if part of what we can do to serve others is to be a warning of what not to do, and that's how I spoke in the Philippines, and that's how I'll speak later on in Ecuador coming up this fall, then that's also a service. And I also, in the course of discerning this mission, really questioned God and wondered, is this what I'm going to be all about? Euthanasia, really? I was not sure about it. And I prayed a lot before the Blessed Sacrament, and I had this confirmation of the value of this, because it's not just the issue of euthanasia. It's the issue of whether or not it's good to be in the world at all. It's the issue of love and existence and meaning and our deepest identity as beloved children of a Father who loved us into existence. And insofar as these issues touch every issue, they don't get boring, they don't get old. They are ever new, they are always enlivening, and they're an entry point to people's hearts in a way that is genuinely life-giving and ultimately uplifting. And so that's the basis for my hope in the course of doing this otherwise very challenging work.
Amanda, I have a question that I thought of before and I had forgotten. I want to ask because this is on the topic of free will, which is fundamental to our faith as Christians. So I've actually had the argument posed to me of, if people really do have free will, why can they not choose to die? So I'm just curious what your response is to that, because I'm sure you've probably heard it before.
Yeah, I remember in 2016 when I was studying philosophy in Poland and actually reading Augustine's book on the free choice of the will. And I was very surprised that Augustine was talking about suicide in that book. And I was finding that everything he was discussing was very similar to the kind of court cases surrounding euthanasia. What Augustine discusses there is how people who say that they desire to die cannot really desire not to exist, or don't really desire not to be. They desire goods, they desire being. And to check that against kind of the empirical facts, I started to look at these court cases and realize, yeah, like the main kind of figures who were being put forward and touted as kind of the reason to legalize euthanasia were saying, I want autonomy, I want comfort, I want dignity, I want respect, I want whatever it may be. And so, like Augustine says, those are goods. Those are not desires that you obtain by not being. Mm-hmm. And so we can attend to the person and we can actually map onto their will by recognizing the goods for which they genuinely seek and helping to satisfy those goods, because those goods will always be more being, not the annihilation of being.
I really like in your explanations that you've just given, both to what I was saying and what Rigel just asked, highlighting vocation, a calling, responding positively to God's will for your life. Even it sounds like even there have been times where it might not be what you wanted. If given the choice, there might have been something else you would have said yes to, and yet this is what God has put in your path and you have been open to it. And so I think obviously your story is unique because most people probably won't find themselves in a scenario like that. But every single person who is prepared to spend time opening themselves up to God's will be called somewhere, right? And that'll look vastly different for every person. But both Rigel and I know that we feel like that, and we feel like we're responding to God's call to use the tools that He's given us, the skills that He's given us, the opportunities He's presented to us, and use those things just as you are, whatever it is, to show love, to make a difference, to do all those things. Simple examples for Rigel and I. We're finance guys. We like startups. We know a thing or two about business. We'd probably be awful at what you do, Amanda. So, I can't even imagine doing what you do. So I'm probably not called there, but I am called, I think, in some respects. I'm pretty cavalier. I'm not easily bullied. I'm not scared by many things. I also have a bit of a LinkedIn following now, so people can't cancel me the way they used to. And I'm a finance person. It'd be really easy for me to just shut up and go get a job in private equity and make a lot of money and live really comfortably. And that would be turning my back on where I'm called. And so what I'm doing instead is having conversations like this, which means tackling controversial issues, unpopular issues, messy issues that will close a lot of employment doors. And I've just made peace with that. And I think Rigel has too. And so to anyone who's listening, our examples, Rigel and I, like there's a bajillion business people, so we're not special. Amanda, though, is doing something. There's very few people in this part of the world, if any, who are doing exactly what you're doing. And so if you're listening, I want to encourage you to open yourself up to God's will for your life and responding positively to it. It can be really scary. Trust me, I know it is. It is scary, but it can also be incredibly rewarding. And what's better than responding to God's will? He knows better than you do, obviously. So if you can be open to it, I encourage people to take the time to do so. Amanda, before we wrap up here, because we're getting towards the end of our time, do you have any recommendations or advice for our listeners who might not know very much about the issues of euthanasia, medical assistance in dying in this country or even in other countries, because we have listeners from other parts of the world too? Any advice or recommendations for people who might not know very much about these issues?
Sure. The first thing I want to do is commend you on the podcast. I've been enjoying it, and I encourage more listeners and more sharing of it. It's a good example of not waiting to get started. You just go for it and grow. And I think this is a beautiful witness that everyone can start something and make something beautiful of it. And that's what you're doing. And this, I hope, will be an encouragement to others. I could never have known on my first and second and third day deciding to blog about death amidst the pandemic for 15 minutes or longer. Sometimes the blogs took much longer than that, but whatever it was, I could never have imagined that initial commitment and effort would become this whole broader initiative. But it was just this fidelity to starting small and doing the little that I could, because it's important that we're already doing the things that count, because we never know how long we'll have. So my encouragement to others is, whether you have a big skull on your desk or not, make sure that you're already doing the things that count, already finding opportunities to be generous, to go outside of yourself, to be audacious. And specifically on the issue of euthanasia, think about the people in your life who are at the greatest risk of being discarded, dismissed, and discounted. Who in your life is at risk of being discarded, dismissed, or discounted? Some of those persons might be ones you pass in the street. Others may be in your own family. Go to them with a sense of mission that perhaps if you don't love this person, nobody else will. And then you will find a task to which you are summoned and a meaning for your life.
I just wanted to add one comment, because my dad literally just sent me a text today, and it said, God cannot steer a parked car. So thank you, Amanda, for pointing that out. As long as we are doing the things that matter to us right now, we don't know where it'll lead. Maybe it leads nowhere, but so what? As long as we're doing something, Holy Spirit will guide us. God will guide us. He will put us on the right path eventually, even if we're not on it right now. So great call to action there. Thank you for that.
And I'd also add on to that, because Amanda, you obviously you're in the public space. You have a platform. You also, as a result of that, Rigel, and I know this all too well, you expose yourself to criticism, even potentially hate. Without even asking you, I already know there are going to be some people that say things about you just because you have the opposite view of them. And in our culture, which is social media obsessed, and everybody can be violent with their words, sitting comfortably behind a computer and never being held to account for their words, that's all too easy. And so I'm sure you receive some of that. Rigel and I, in different circumstances, do as well. And that's hard. And so if you're listening to this, I'm not saying that to scare you. Maybe you aren't the kind of person to do what Amanda does, bravely confront, complex issues in the public space, but you can encourage those people who are doing it at the very least. And so please do that. Go check out Amanda's work. Share it with others. If it resonates with you, don't just say, that was interesting, give it a like, and then pretend you didn't encounter it. Share it with other people that need to know about this, right? And collectively, that sort of stuff makes a difference, even if you aren't the person called to be on the front line the way Amanda is. Those people do exist. Amanda exists. You can support her. do a little more than you're inclined to do. So that's my call and request to anyone that's listening to this following this conversation. Rigel, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, one more thing, Amanda, before we do wrap up, I just want to get a testimony from you. We've talked about how it can be difficult to do the work that you're doing, just being on the front lines. Can you maybe speak to how God has worked in your life and how you've benefited from the work that you're doing, like the blessings that you've experienced since you started?
One of the most clarifying experiences is the reflective distance, time taken in prayer, time spent before the Blessed Sacrament, of discussing with our Lord what have been the high points of this year. That's different than maybe what I might post online. Very likely it is different than what I might post on Instagram or Facebook. And there's this clarity that the most meaningful times of my year have been these times of great intimacy and communion, particularly getting to hear, receive, and eventually communicate the stories of people with great vulnerabilities. And in the course of that trust, it's just irresistible. Whatever may come my way, I've befriended these people and we have done something together. We have told their story. We have advocated for others in their situation. Nothing can take that away. Nothing can take away the preciousness of intimate conversations. Nothing can take away the experience of Uber drivers confiding experiences of euthanasia in their own family, or of people lining up after a talk to share experiences of grief and loss. That trust is priceless, and I'm restored to my purpose and resolve through just cherishing that, but cherishing that in the presence of God, who brings clarity to all that we do.
Thank you for that, Amanda. For those listening, if you don't know what Amanda means when she says Blessed Sacrament, because we have a lot of non-Catholics, this is a plug for another one of our episodes. Go look up our episode on spiritual experiences. We explain it there. So as soon as this one ends, go do that, because she's referenced it a few times. It's incredible. We've talked about it before, so please do that. Rigel, do you want to conclude in prayer for us?
Absolutely. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord our God, we come before you today with an urgent cry for help. We call on you to end this culture of death that exists in our world. This life you have given us is a beautiful gift, even when it is filled with suffering. You always give us opportunities to rise above and become the masters of our suffering, but people are struggling. We ask you to empower all of us gathered here, all our listeners and all your faithful, to fight against this culture of death with the beauty of life. We pray all this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rigel. Thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us, for having this conversation, for the work that you're doing. May God continue to bless you, strengthen you, and empower you abundantly. For everyone who's listening, please check out Amanda's work. Hopefully we'll be able to have her back in the future for another conversation and learn more about the important work that she's doing. Until then, this has been the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.
God bless.